We're going to continue in our series in the book of Acts. We're approaching towards the end of the book of Acts and following Paul's journey to Rome, which God had commanded him to do, and Paul by all means is going to follow through with what God told him to do. We're going to be looking at Acts chapter 25. We're going to be looking at all 27 verses. So we'll be looking at verses 1 through 27 in the book of Acts. And we'll look at three specific points. Verses 1 through 12, Paul before Festus. 13 to 22, Festus and Agrippa. And then 23 to 27, Paul before Agrippa. Paul before Festus. If you look at the verses here, we're going to look at some things here that about the character of God. And we're going to look at the character, and God was emphasizing His very character in us, in our lives. And I look at my own life, and I look at how over the years, through thick and thin, through what has happened, God has always reminded me, He has always reminded me of who He is and what He has done. And it was so critically important. If you see Scripture and you look at Scripture throughout the course of the history of the children of God, God has always reminded them of who He is and what He's all about and what He is able to do. And so critically, and for me, that was so critically important throughout my life. I remember times where God would show me, I am your Father. I needed to hear that. I needed to know that. The Father in the real sense of the word, what a father is. And my soul needed to hear that. God reminded me of times when He told me, I'm faithful. Do you have a need here? I got it. You saw me provide in the desert, so to speak. Remember those times? I took care of you. Remember when you were little and your family had nothing? I took care of you. I was right there. Remember how I was faithful? Remember when you didn't know what to do and you needed wisdom? Remember how I came along? I'm a God of wisdom, and I gave you what you needed to know what to do at the right time. Think about your own life. Think about the different situations you've been in. And think about the times where you needed to know who God was. You need to know who God was in your life. How God reminded you, I'm your Father. How God reminded you that I'm faithful. How God reminded you that I'm your protector. How God reminded you how I'm going to take care of you. How God reminded you that He's going to care for you and He's going to give you wisdom. He's going to show you what to do. Think about those times in your life. Now think about Paul. Paul here has been through a whole lot in his life. Now Paul is approaching towards the end of his life. He's still got several years left to go, but he doesn't have much time. But Paul has been through thick and thin with the Lord. And this time, Paul is looking at, and he's on trial. He's on trial for his life. But he also has been shown that God has a plan for him, and God wants him to accomplish that plan. And so God always reminds Paul, and it makes Paul aware of who he is. And what does that do for Paul? That encourages him, that strengthens him, that undergirds his faith in who God is and what God wants to do through him. And so that's what we're going to see today. And we're going to see God work in a supernatural, powerful, wonderful way in the life of Paul. Let's go look at this. Our first point, Paul before Festus. And some things here is that, remember in these verses, this is verses 1 through 12. As we look at this, Festus is the new governor. Felix was the previous governor. Now these are governors that were set up by the Roman government. And these are not necessarily nice, kind, just men. These are men that often relied on, as we saw last week, bribes and other nefarious means to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish in order to stay in power. The Romans were known for that. I was just reading just recently an article about the Romans back where they had an outpost in Great Britain, and they found remnants of some coins that were used back in the Roman time that were used for bribery. The Romans were known for that. Yes, the Romans were known for that, just like it is today. It's not, things don't change. There's nothing new under the sun. And that's how they operate. And so this Governor Festus, was by the same means was the same way. And so let's look at here. He's in Jerusalem, and the chief priests and the Jews. We look at verses 1 through 6 before the chief priests and the Jews. And the Jews are bringing charges against Paul here. And look at this in these verses in 1 through 6. They're bringing charges against Paul, and they request that Paul be brought to where? To Jerusalem. To stand trial? No, the Jews weren't looking for justice themselves. They weren't looking for justice. They weren't looking to give Paul a fair and speedy trial. They were sinners just like everyone else. They were looking to do what to Paul? If you look at those verses, they were looking to verse 2, they're bringing charges so that if they bring Paul back from Jerusalem, now Paul, remember, is not in Jerusalem, he's in Caesarea. Remember how the troops, the soldiers had brought him to Caesarea? Well, the Jews wanted him to come back to Jerusalem so he could stand trial, not so he could stand trial, so they could ambush him on the way and kill him. So we see here that they had nefarious, ulterior motives for wanting Paul to come back to Jerusalem. Not for justice, but so they could kill him and take him out. How's that for justice? How's that for getting a fair and speedy trial? Now think about that. Now it goes on here. Think about how, and this is where I come back to the character of God. Here these Jews want to do what? These Jews want to take out Paul. They want to kill Paul. But think about Paul throughout his whole life, even especially in his walk with God, how God has protected him. What do you think is going on in Paul's mind right now? Paul knows what the Jews want to do. So what do you think is going on in Paul's mind right now, in his heart? God, I don't know how this is all going to work out. I know what these Jews want to do. Paul wasn't naive to the fact that the Jews wanted to take him out. But the reality is that Paul understood his God. Paul knew his God. Paul knew the character of his God because Paul had walked with God. And Paul experienced God. He has a relationship with God. So he knew that if God protected him before, if God cared for him before, what's God got to do now? God's going to protect him now. So what is Paul looking at? Paul's reminded of God's character. Paul's reminded of, hey, you know what? God's got this under control. I don't understand it, but I know that God's going to take care of me. But listen to how God works. And then verse 4, it says, Festus decides to keep Paul in custody at Caesarea. How about that? So what does God do? God uses a Gentile man, a man who doesn't even know God, to execute his justice. So what do we see here? That God protects, but also what does God do? God is what kind of God? He is a just God. He is a just God that's going to make sure that Paul gets the justice that he needs in order to accomplish what God wants him to accomplish and for what God wants him to do. So not only does God protect, but Paul is reminded, you know what? God's always been just with me. God is not an unjust God, but he's a just God. He is a just God. And somebody told me this before, but this makes a lot of sense. I think I learned this in seminary. Is that God cannot cease to be anything less than all his character says he is. Does that make sense? In other words, if God God cannot be unjust, or he would cease to be God. God cannot cease, he cannot cease to protect, because then he would cease to be God. In other words, if God is incapable of being unjust. God is incapable of not protecting. God is incapable of not being faithful, or he would cease to be God. So it's impossible for God not to be these things. And the reality is that God is always going to do what he says he's going to do, and he's going to watch out, and he's going to care for his people, and he's never going to stop not being who he is. And so in this case, God is going to continue to protect Paul, but also God's going to continue to provide justice. And how do you provide justice? By making Festus give the decision to keep Paul in Caesarea, so the Jews won't kill him and the Jews won't take him out. See how God intervenes? God will use a Gentile judge. God will use a Gentile person in order to accomplish his purpose and his plan and his direction for him and what he wants for his people. So and it goes on here. So we see here that the Jews come up to Caesarea with Festus and to be tried there. Festus goes to Caesarea with the Jews. The next day he takes his seat on the tribunal, ordering that Paul be brought. And now here, this is so neat. So God is a just God. So what is God doing? God is setting up for Paul to be just, to judge in a just way, so that Paul gets a fair trial. This is really important because if Paul doesn't get a fair trial, then Paul's life could be taken. But God's not going to let that happen anyway. But God's going to provide the justice because God is just. And it says in verses 7 through 12, it says the Jews, in verse 7, it says the Jews bring serious charges against Paul that they couldn't prove. Now we know we watch all these court shows. My wife and I like Law and Order. And the thing is that in order to convict someone who is being charged with the crime, you need to have burden of proof. You have to have the proof in order to charge them, to show them guilty. Well, what are the Jews trying to do? The Jews are trying to show Paul guilty of whatever crimes that they say that he has done. But it says here, it says they have serious charges. Underline that word serious, that they couldn't prove. In other words, they had no proof. Although the burden of proof was on them, they didn't have any. See how God is in control? God's got it all worked out. They're not going to accomplish what they want to accomplish. Man, you're too short to box with God. Man is not going to overcome God. Man's plan, although man thinks that he is in control, although man thinks that he's got things worked out, man has a very limited and little view knowledge of God. Because they think, well, we can get over on God. But they don't know God. They don't know God. They don't. If they think that they can get over on God. Because God sees all, knows all, God's everywhere. God is the all-wise God, isn't he? Absolutely. And there's nothing, no one, nowhere, not the smartest person in the world that's going to get over on God. And you're stupid and foolish to think that you can. And these Jewish folks were thinking that they can get over on God by trying to prosecute Paul on false charges. And these are supposed to be men of God. Thinking they can get over on God. How foolish they really were. Because they didn't know God. Because you can't fool God. But then, this is really neat. It says, but Paul defends himself. I have done no wrong to Jews or to Caesar. In other words, I've done no wrong to you, Jewish folks, to my people, and I've done no wrong to Caesar or to the Roman people. I've done no wrong. But it says Paul defends himself. But here is neat. God is a wise God. Wise in the sense that he gives Paul and he shows Paul what to do. Not only does God protect, not only does God not only does God give the justice that is needed, but also God gives what? Wisdom in the time, in the moment that you need it. And what did God give to Paul here? God gave Paul, because God's a wise God, God gave Paul the wisdom to what to do and to what to say at that right moment. Think about that. How many of us sometimes when we're in a pickle, in a situation, and we really need to know what to do, and the moment we have the wisdom and the understanding to do what we're supposed to do? Where do you think that comes from? God. And at this moment, Paul was given the wisdom and the understanding and the words to speak what he was supposed to speak at that moment and at that time. Because he serves what? A wise God. And Paul knew that. He knew his God. He knew his God was a wise God. Remember the benediction. I forget. It's in one of the epistles to the all-wise God. Who's the all-wise God? God Almighty. Amen. Amen. And then it goes on here and it says, and so Festus, Paul defends himself. And then in verse 12 it says, after Festus confers with the council, it goes on here, and then Paul says, and part of Paul's wisdom is that Paul does what? He appeals to Caesar. Now what does that mean? That means that Paul was going, even though the Jews, it says here that Festus wanted to do the Jews a favor. So he was going to try and pervert justice. Again, we see God's a God of justice. So what does Paul do? What Paul do? Paul has the wisdom to defend himself, but also Paul has the wisdom to do what? To appeal to Caesar. Because he knows that he appeals to Caesar, the Romans are going to provide the justice that Paul needs. Because remember, Paul's a Roman citizen. And if Paul's not, if they let a Roman citizen not get the justice, and the higher ups, even the governor Festus, hear that a Roman citizen didn't get what their Roman citizens should have gotten as far as justice, then they were in big trouble. So Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. So what does Paul do? He knew that he wasn't going to get justice with the governor, so he appeals to who? I appeal to Caesar. So he knew that Festus' hands were tied, because he knew that if Paul appealed to Caesar, he was going to have to give Paul justice, and to Caesar he was going to go. But that was wisdom for Paul to use, I appeal to Caesar. Because he knew that he was going to go to Rome like God had originally intended, but also that he was going to get the justice that he needed, but also that he was going to have an opportunity, perhaps have an opportunity to share the gospel with who? The head of state of the Roman Empire at that time was Caesar. So think about that. So we see here God protects, God gives justice, God gives wisdom. And God will do what he needs to do in order to protect his people and make sure that people get justice and people are able to accomplish what he calls them to accomplish. So let's go on here, verses 13 to 22. God is in Festus and Agrippa. Agrippa and Bernice arrive at Caesarea. It says, after many days, in verse 1, Festus lays Paul's case before Agrippa. And verses 15 to 21. And so he goes through the whole case of Paul with Agrippa. Now Agrippa is the king, remember. This is King Agrippa and his wife. It says they came with much pomp and stance. In other words, a lot of extra, like, people coming and look at me, this is who I am, I'm the king, and he was here with the governor. And so they're having this conference, and Festus was saying, well, what do I do? We see here a couple of things. Is that it says in verse 15, it says, the Jews bring charges against Paul, and this is Festus conveying this before Agrippa. to sentence him to death. But he says in verse 16, Roman law accused has an opportunity to make his defense, and Paul did that. And it goes on here, and it says that after they had assembled, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought to me. When his accusers stood up, in verse 18, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but simply had points of disagreement with him about their own religion, about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. And when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered that he be kept in custody until he goes to Caesar. The whole point here is that Festus didn't know what to do. Here's Paul's being brought up in charges against these Jews, and he's conveying this to King Agrippa, none of whom know God. None of them who know the Jewish law. And Festus is saying, well, what do I do? How do I send him to Rome? He appealed to Caesar. Now what do I do? Who's in control of that? God is. Paul knew that. Paul knew that God was in control. Paul knew that God had this all worked out. Festus didn't know what he was doing. How am I going to prosecute this man? How am I going to send him to Rome? What am I going to tell the emperor? Well, Paul knew in his own heart and his own mind that God was ultimately in control. And we need to remember that as well. Who is in control of our situation or circumstance? God is. He's a God of order. He's not going to let, even though man is not in control, even though man is not going to accomplish what he wants to be accomplished, God is. And God is going to make sure that he accomplishes what he wants to accomplish, even when man can't. And so often what happens is that we depend on man to get us out of things, don't we? Sometimes. We do. We think that man, nothing wrong with that. But, depending on, what we ask people to do. But the reality is that we think that man can save us. That men can look out for us. That men can care for us. And the reality is that God is ultimately in control, not men. Men are finite. God is infinite. Men are fallible. God's infallible. Men are foolish. God's all wise. We need to remember that. Remember who our God is and that He is in control, not man. So we cannot always put all our eggs in the basket and trust in man. Because men are finite and men will disappoint us. Men will disappoint us. Men meaning people. I mean that in a generic sense. I don't mean men in the male sense. So that's important to remember that. It says, and then our last point is Paul before Agrippa. It says, Festus says to Agrippa, and they come together, and they bring, and Festus comes and he arrives, and Agrippa comes and he arrives, and Festus says to Agrippa in verse 24, and to all the people that were there, you see this man, Paul, the Jews declaring that he ought not to live. So again, what is Paul looking at here? What is Paul thinking? That, and here's these Jewish people, and then now there's Festus, and now there's Agrippa, and they're standing trial before these Jews, and the Jews are declaring what? That Paul ought not to live. So Agrippa's hearing for himself the fact that Paul ought not to live. And what do you think Paul's thinking? Well, these Jews, I know that Festus wants to do the Jews a favor. He wants to be in cahoots with the Jews because he wants to be liked by the Jews. But Paul's thinking, you know what? My God, again, it comes down to, my God, he reminds himself, my God is what? Is a just judge. My God is the one who makes perfect decisions. the right decision, the perfect choice that he wants to happen. He's going to provide the perfect justice. He is a just judge. And remember that, folks, because sometimes the biggest thing that we struggle with in our lives is the injustice in our lives. Well, why did this happen? 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 Why? And we look at all the injustices and all the things that happen in our lives and in our world. How do you think? And then think about this. Think about Job. Read the last several chapters of the book of Job, like 39 through 42. And God gives, because Job complained about, Job went through a heck of a lot. He lost his kids, and he lost more than most people go through in a whole lifetime, in a short period of time. He lost all his wealth, he lost everything. And then God, on top of it, he gets all these boils. And then Job gets down, he's the downer, Danny Downer, in the situation, and he's looking at, where's my justice? Where's my justice? Where is my justice? Where's the justice that's due me? But if you look at Job, you look at the end of those chapters, God gives him a good talking to. And God reminds him, were you there when I made the creation? Were you there when I did the stars? Were you there when I did all these other things? Were you there when I made the Leviathan? Were you there when I made all these creatures? Were you there? Were you there? And then Job says, I spoke prematurely. And I put my hands over my mouth. Because he knew and he understood that he spoke about God, which was untrue. Which was that God was not an unjust God. And so Job learned a valuable lesson there. That he learned that God is a just God who does things for his own reason, for his purpose, but he never does things unjustly. He never, ever does things unjustly. Never. He's always a perfect, just God. And his motivation is always with a good reason and a good purpose. And Paul knew that. Going back to Paul, Paul knew that and understood that his God was a just God. As it turned out for Job, God blessed Job in his latter days, more so than he had in his previous days. And the reality is that God used Paul, as you go fast forward, as we're going to look in the next several weeks, is that God used Paul to have a great impact and influence when he was in Rome to reach the Roman hierarchy while he was in prison there. The reality is that God had a purpose and plan, and God's justice was going to be fulfilled. Even though man was going to try and intervene, even though these Jewish folks and these Jewish leaders and these and the governors and these kings were trying to get Paul to be found guilty, God was in control. And God was just, and God was going to accomplish what he wanted to be accomplished. And so, and look at this. If you look at verse 25, it says, they found that he had committed nothing worthy of death. How just is God? They saw for themselves that Paul committed nothing worthy of death. He appealed to Caesar, and we decided to send him to Caesar. He appealed to Caesar, then to Caesar you shall go. And what's going to happen? Paul's going to get justice, and Paul's going to be able to accomplish what God wanted to accomplish in the first place. Which was what? To share the gospel with Rome, in Rome, as he originally had planned. And so think about these things. You think about how, you think about our lives, you think about how we walk through our lives every day. And we go through circumstances, and we're people of experience. And we have many experiences, some great experiences, some not so great, and some difficult experiences. And the reality is that during those experiences, what did we do when we look back on them. How did we respond? From what perspective did we look at in those circumstances? Did we look at those experiences as, well, God forsaken me during those times? I had some really tough times when I was a kid, youngest of 10, where we went bankrupt, we lost everything. Lost everything literally. We had literally no food. Literally no food. And someone comes knocking on the door Thanksgiving Day, one of my teachers, and brought us a whole, 12 people, brought us a whole basket full of food. And as an adult, that reminded me of what? Of God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness. God used that school teacher to provide. How God, where my life could have been taken out. I think of times as a child where my life could have been taken in a moment, in a flash of an eye. I literally, as a kid, I remember, saw my life pass before me. As a kid, at different times. And I saw how God, in His faithfulness, protected me. And as an adult, that reminded me of what? His protection. Think about those situations in your life where your life could have been taken in a moment. I'm sure we've all been there. I'm sure we've all been there. Where we needed to know who our God was. As you look back, how you needed provision and how God provided. He knew His faithfulness. How you needed His protection and God protected you. How you needed to have wisdom and God gave you the wisdom. Now fast forward it now to your life now. What do you do when you encounter situations like that now? What do? You remind yourself of what? Of your God and who your God is. That He's what? He's a protector. That He's a faithful God. He's a just God. He's an all-wise God. He's an all-powerful God. He's an ever-present God. He's an all-knowing God. And on and on and on and on and on and on and on. God is. God is. And you remind yourself, because God is not through with me yet. There's a great song that my son Seth loves to sing. It's sung by Mandisa. She's a great artist. And she struggled with some things, and she struggled, and she fell back into some of those things. She struggled with her weight. And she sang a song called Overcomer. And she was really struggling with that, and then she overcame, and she sang a song, I Overcame, because she really had struggled with her weight. And then she came back. And then she fell back into it because her best friend had died. And she couldn't get over that. And she says, but you know what? God's not finished with me yet. She wrote another song, it's out now, that says, God's not finished with me yet. Because God's doing wonderful work. She reminded herself what? Of who her God is. And that's the same thing that we need to do, folks, is that we need to remind ourselves when we're in situations, we're in circumstances, and we need God, we need to remind ourselves of who our God is. Because our God is a God who is everything. That He is everything who He is. And we need to remind ourselves and encourage us. And read the book of Psalms. They're replete with things about the character of God. Book of Isaiah, book of Jeremiah. All the whole scriptures are replete of who our God is. Remind yourselves, folks. Remind yourself. Next time, whenever, because as you do, you're going to see your God in action. Amen.